And I'm going to go right into a screen share. Well, come on up. Don't complain about it. And you'll notice this is kind of a long slideshow because what I'm doing is just keeping a running slideshow as we go through the 4 different fasts. So where we did the 17th of Tammuz last week, and we're going to study the 9th of Av this week. And then we're going to circle back around and we're going to look at the feast of the 7th month, Gedalia, after that. And even though we've covered some things on the 10th of Tebet, we might back up a little bit, you know, and just wrap some things up so that we have a really good presentation on the 4 fasts. And we're just kind of weaving them into the Torah portions. So they're not as Torah portion heavy while we're doing these 4 lessons. But I think you'll be able to see some connections, not just with the Torah portions, but with some things that we've done in recent Torah portions, because it hasn't been that long since we had the Torah portion Shalach and the evil report of the 10 spies. And that's going to be some of the content tonight, going back to that Torah portion, because now that we're in the 3 weeks, or we're in the straits, we're moving between the breach and the city wall. Izzy, could you not do that? And moving into the actual destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the temple and all the things that followed after that. So as we move into that season, we want to have to slide back a little bit into the Torah portion that addresses what we would say is the first calamity of the 9th of Av, which is going to be the evil report of the 10 spies, the Israelites' refusal to go in at that time. We're going to unpack that and see what are the dynamics beneath that, because if we can figure out what some of those dynamics are in their report on the land and how the Israelites responded to that report, then we have some self-examination points for ourselves and some prayer points for ourselves at this season, because we know everything is cyclical. And what the Israelites would have been going through at this time, remember, if we set our sandals back in their time period, then right now, the representatives from the 10 tribes are out in the land of Israel right now exploring. And we can be in prayer for that. We have to bring it down into our generation, but just it gives us a sense of immediacy, I think, that had we been living in that generation, those 12 people would be out there doing the exploration, and we would be sitting back at our tents just waiting eagerly for them to return and see what they had to say about it. So that means I'm going to scan through quite a bit of this, because we're going to have to go back through last week's information to catch up to and we'll actually repeat a little bit of it. And I don't know if I had actually done the calculations last week. By the time I finished the class on Tuesday, if I didn't, this is probably an additional slide that you didn't see last week, because I couldn't present it on the live stream because I don't have the ability to do slides right now. So you can see Daniel's days if we calculate them out from the 17th of Tammuz, just an example we took this year and calculated that out. And Colleen Martin also did it. She's more the mathematical mind than I am, but ironically, my notebook, my calculations ended up the same as hers. So that made me feel better that I can still do 8th grade math. At any rate, remember Daniel says, calculate 1,290 days from the 17th of Tammuz, which we know is the time that the daily sacrifice ceased and the time that the abomination was put into the temple. If you calculate out that 1,290 days, you land on the 10th of Shabbat. And I went through and looked at some things, and he said, blessed, though, is the one who attains to the 1,335th day. That calculates out to the 25th of Adar. And we know that to be the date that marks the death of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylonia. And that's also the date on which the king of Judah, Jehoiachin, is released from the Babylonian prison and promoted to eat from the king's table. So it's a year of release from prison, and the prison of Babylon. So you could kind of dance a jig right there, because you see what Daniel is prophesying. He's prophesying even though he's in Babylon, even though he is in that confusion of exile. Nevertheless, Daniel prophesies about attaining this second date, which will be marked by the death of the Babylonian king and the release of the king of Judah from prison. So that's pretty remarkable as we're looking forward. And that was my curiosity. Does this cycle repeat itself, you know, in an ongoing way? And I gave some people that challenge on Shabbat, that if they love numbers and they love research, then go back in history and just recalculate it. And you'll have to find some place that has world events, or maybe events that relate to Israel. I think you could even do it with the United States, and see if there's anything that stands out on these particular days, like the 25th of Adar. Also notice that when we talk about Adar, we're talking about a very dangerous and difficult time for the Jews in Persia, because remember the decree that had gone out where the Jews could have been killed. They could have been wiped out of Persia, but there was that intervention, even though it was in those dark days. And so if you can attain to the 25th of Adar, it might look like you're about to be completely wiped out, but Daniel says, hang on. Attain to the 25th of Adar, and there will be a release. There will be something to rejoice about. And of course, that's what Zechariah prophesies on his fast dates, is that what was a time of mourning and difficulty and calamity, those will turn into days of joy. So that brings us to the 9th of Av. The special psalm for the 9th of Av is Psalm 137. And again, those are embedded into the link email. I've just left that link in there for you to be able to click on and to look up the Psalms for each Torah portion and for the holidays and so forth, so that you can access that at any time if you just hang on to one of your old link emails. I'll just leave that in there. Which brings us to this week's Torah portion, Matot Masei. It's a double portion, and Matot is tribes, and Masei is the journeys of. And there's your scripture readings. And there's really, for tonight, I may do more tomorrow, but for tonight, there's really just one section that I want to focus on, because it's going to help us to tie in to a pattern that we're also going to see when we look into the 9th of Av. And it's from Numbers 31, 3-6. And it says, Moses spoke to the people saying, and just to give you context, I think this is the portion either last year or year before last that was called 144,000 Reasons to Read the Torah portion. Because we drew a parallel among the tribes that were selected and the process of selection and the 144,000 in the book of Revelation. And so if you still have that, you can go back into that playlist. I'm not sure that it's on there, but I think I did something similar that might be on the public playlist on YouTube. You can probably go back, and if you save these downloads from Zoom, you can probably go back and find it. At any rate, it says, Moses spoke to the people saying, arm men from among you for the war, that they may go against Midian to execute the Lord's vengeance on Midian. 1,000 from each tribe of all the tribes of Israel you shall send to the war. So there were furnished from the thousands of Israel 1,000 from each tribe, 12,000 armed for war. Moses sent them, 1,000 from each tribe, to the war. And Pinchas, the son of Eleazar the priest, to the war with them, and the holy vessels and the trumpets for the alarm in his hand. So what I put in bold there was that last sentence. We know that Pinchas is now basically the war priest. And what do? They take holy vessels with them when they go to war. Now, which vessels exactly did they take? According to Rashi, he says this is the ark and the tzitz. And the tzitz, if you'll remember, is the headband, the crown that the high priest wore. And so when it says the sacred vessels, there's lots of sacred vessels. But Rashi's comment is that it was specifically the ark and then the headband of the high priest, because that particular article had the holy name. It had Yod He Vav He inscribed into it. So those would have been the two items. But it says Pinchas takes the holy vessels, which means that he would have needed 4 Levites to carry it. Remember, you can't put it on an ox cart. And he also takes the trumpets for the alarm in his hand. The parallel I want you to draw right there is it's describing in the passage the selection of the tribes. But as we've seen in the past, the principle of smichut, or placement, tells us an additional level. So he's not just describing thousands from each tribe, and it goes back again to the numbering. He's not just describing the selection of an army. He's also describing a spiritual army. And in this case, there's an analogy. He's saying, okay, these are the holy warriors of Israel. Why are they holy? Because of this past experience with Midian and the Moabite women. There was a plague. We had to stop and we had to deal with this. We had to purify ourselves. And now what we have left is going to be holy vessels that I'm going to send against the Midianites to get vengeance on them. In the text, in the placement of it, in the smichut, we're told in the same breath that Pinchas is going to take the holy vessels. And so the comparison there is that the people, the warriors themselves, are holy vessels. This is an equivalent expression to this. And that helps us sometimes when we're reading a passage that speaks of vessels. And we kind of get that when we read the Brit Chadashah, because it talks there about, being earthen vessels and so forth. And then it talks about, there's silver and there's gold vessels, there's wood vessels, there's whatever, and each has its own use. And again, that's the metaphor of people. And so in this Torah portion, it helps us to understand that the holy vessels of the Mishkan and later the holy vessels of the temple are going to be its most precious people. And that's the understanding. when we look at the Mishkan, when we look at the temple, when we look at the walls of Jerusalem, those things are composed of what is precious to Adonai, and that is his people. So let's go back and let's look at Daniel's prophecy. Daniel 12, 9 through 13. He says, "Go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the end time. Many will be purged, purified, and refined." In other words, some holy vessels will be found. He says, "But the wicked will act wickedly, and none of the wicked will understand. But those who have insight will understand. From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335 days. But as for you, go your way to the end. Then you will enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age." And so right here, he's not saying really you have to have a temple or you have to have an altar. You just have to know what time the daily offering ceased and that the abomination of desolation was set up in the temple. And we know what that is because last week we studied the 17th of Tammuz. And if we know that date, then he says, then we can calculate out these days, and he encourages us to be patient. So Daniel has given us a GPS for this season, for the 3 weeks, for the straits, for this calamitous time, where we're looking at fast dates, mourning, the destruction of Jerusalem, its walls, and we can add to that the holy vessels. And as you read through some of these passages, it will describe the holy vessels that were carried away at different times by the kings of Babylon. But I want to just focus on Daniel, since his language is so strong as it pertains to the straits or the 3 weeks. I'm going to take some more time and look at Daniel because he's a man who's known for fasting and prayer. So maybe it's not surprising that Daniel would be the prophet who would prophesy specifically about something that would need to be calculated from the 17th of Tammuz. That would be associated with the 3 weeks, because Daniel was a man of fasting and prayer. So on the 9th of Av, it says in the Talmud, it says it was decreed upon our ancestors that they would not be allowed to enter the land of Israel. Remember, that's when we get the evil report of the spies. The first and second temples were destroyed. Beitar was captured. The city of Jerusalem was plowed over. So when the month of Av starts, we reduce joy. So there's a whole list of things, traditions that are associated with this particular period. A list of things associated with the 3 weeks in general, and then there will be extra things that will be associated with the 9 days. So the 9 days, you say, oh my goodness, you keep talking about all these numbers. The 4th month, the 5th month, the 10th month, the 7th month, 3 weeks, the straits. These are terms that, they're nothing to be afraid of. There's not going to be a pop quiz on them tomorrow. And it's okay if they're all jumbled up in your head right now. That is totally fine right now. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to learn about them. And as we cycle through them each year, more and more of it will stick. And more and more we will have context for what we're reading. And if we're patient and we allow that to happen every year, then our grasp of not just the feast days, but also even these fast days, it can grow very organically. And you don't need to pressure yourself and say, this is just all confusing. That's normal when you're learning something new. or something that maybe you've just read over it real quick each year. Never thought it was important, but now all of a sudden it's important because we had a siege that started on the 10th of Tevet, just like Ezekiel prophesied. So this year we're paying attention. So like I said, don't pressure yourself too much. But the 9 days are part of the 3 weeks. All you have to remember is in kindergarten when you had to do sets and subsets on your little worksheets. And so the 9 days would be a subset of the 3 weeks. So the 3 weeks begin on the 17th of Tammuz, the 4th month. But the 9 days will begin on the 1st of Av, or the 5th month. And so, like I said, there's lots of customs. It's not important that you know them all or try to do them all. But I think, even if each year you pick out a custom or two and look at them and try to figure out, why would they do that? Or why would they not do that? What's the context for that? Then I think it helps to immerse you more in the purpose of the fast. Not just in looking at history past, but how we might be changed to meet history in the future as the living stones of the temple, as the holy vessels of the temple. We want to be prepared for that. For instance, we know that during this period, Jews do not eat meat, including poultry, nor do they drink wine. Because remember, what they're trying to remember during this period is that the sacrifices and the wine libations in the holy temple ceased. So how am I going to remember that? Because really, if the world knew what Israel was doing on their behalf when they offered those sacrifices, they would have never wanted the temple to be destroyed. But that's one of the customs. That's how they remember. They abstain from meat and wine during that period. There are exceptions. If you're going to celebrate Shabbat, then of course you're also obligated to have joy on Shabbat, which supersedes or overrides the custom, and then, like, if you're having a bar mitzvah, if you have to have a circumcision, then again, those celebrations would override, and you would be able to consume meat or wine on that particular day. But we're talking about a custom of a fast day. We're not talking about something at the same level as you would observe, say, for Passover or Sukkot or Shavuot. So don't get like, oh my gosh, I got more rules to learn. Remember, this is not an area where you want to pressure yourself too much. If you only got so much brain power in a day, focus on Shabbat and the feasts. Those are the things that I think are really important. This is important too. But in terms of custom, you need to weigh that out. Because if you take on too much, if you're too eager and you take on too much, you can burn out way too fast. And so you can also be discouraged because you think, I'll never learn all that stuff. And maybe you won't, but it's okay. Again, we're studying little by little. We're like the fig tree. 2 or 3 figs a day is about all we can do. But there's a precedent for this particular custom of abstaining from meat and wine. You say, where would they come up with something like that? Well, the obvious is that the wine libation and the sacrifice ceased in the temple. So we don't run a temple ourselves, but we have a table. And through our own table, we remember the temple. Our house becomes a little temple. And so we don't offer that meat sacrifice on our own table, nor do we offer a wine libation on our own table. There's a lot of symbolism there. So that's the most obvious reason that you would abstain from meat and wine during this season. But like I say, there's another event that happened that we can look at and say, there was something going on there too, Because remember, we're looking at Daniel. He's our fast and prayer model. If you want to know how to fast and pray, you need a good example, you go to Daniel. The book itself is great to learn from. And so we know we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who had been conscripted into the Babylonian king's service. So they're in a dilemma, the same way that we're in a dilemma. We know we're in Babylon. We know that we're living in a world of confusion. That's exactly what Babylon is. It's confusion. And we know we're supposed to come out from Babylon. Now, that's not to say that we're supposed to find a mountain hideout and get as far away from other people as we possibly can. That's not what it means to come out of Babylon. To come out of Babylon means to come out of its confusion. Because in that confusion, we find ourselves wanting to dabble in idolatry. And so Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're presented with the same dilemma that we have today. That's why we can learn from their example. They have been selected to fulfill a divine mission in their generation. And you have to live in the generation in which you were born. We can make a lot of mistakes when we try to live in someone else's generation. This is not Little House on the Prairie, guys. They had their divine mission, but we have our divine mission. And in our generation, he's going to send us to do particular things. As individuals, we will have tasks that we are supposed to accomplish for the kingdom. And our dilemma every single day is, how do I fulfill my divine mission without becoming confused with all this garbage here in Babylon? Well, again, we go back to Daniel. How did he do it? Well, he was a faster and he was a prayer. He was, if we want to use the term, religious about both of them. That meant he had a routine. He knew that he couldn't afford to be haphazard about fasting and prayer. He had appointed times. He had a discipline. And so that's the message to us. How can we come out from the confusion of Babylon, but still accomplish the job we've been sent to do in the Babylonian court? So we have this precedent of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They've been selected because they're so smart, because they're nobles, because they're the cream of the crop that has been taken out of Judah and transplanted into Babylon. And so the offer there is to educate them. I think it was 3 years. I have to go back and look, but I think it was 3 years they were supposed to be educated, maybe 2. In all the things that they would need to know to become part of the Babylonian court, to contribute to that royal culture. And so they're going to be a great example to us that as we contemplate, how am I going to go out in the world and do my job every day and maintain my integrity as a believer, maintain my integrity as an Israelite, maintain my integrity as a holy vessel that has been snatched out of the temple. The way that we do that has got to be through a routine of fasting and prayer. And even when we talk about prayer, we need to think about Hebrew prayer. When you pray the way that Hebrews prayed, they did have set prayers. they did have common prayers. Many of those prayers are found in the Psalms, so that people are not just praying, but they're praying scripture. When you pray scripture, the implication is there that you would also study those scriptures. And so you're feeding on the word itself as part of your prayer discipline. I think the studying the word and prayer, they go hand in hand. And that's why I think it speaks of, calling for skilled people to pray for you. It's not that just anybody can't pray for you. Anybody can pray for you. But when you're facing something difficult, then it says the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much, because the righteous man is immersed in scripture. And so he knows how to pray according to the will of Adonai, because sometimes we pray according to our own will and just hope that, he'll get on board with us. But the practice of Hebrew prayer is we try to figure out what the Holy One wants, and then we get on board with him. And so that's why we pray, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, so that we would be just as obedient. So I think we've already talked about how we need to look if we use Daniel's time of the 17th of Tammuz. And I would do this every year. I wouldn't say, oh, this is special to 2020 and this is the end of the world. I wouldn't do that. I would say every year, when I enter into the straits, when I enter into the 3 weeks, then I need to have an awareness that lots of different spiritual and prophetic cycles are spinning at the exact same time. And the only way that I can do the right thing on the right day at the right time is just to know the biblical calendar and not to try to engage it without the power of the Holy Spirit. If you don't have those two things together, you're still going to have issues. You're going to have problems. But if you have the word, and like Daniel, you have this discipline of prayer and fasting, and I think you're going to be prepared no matter which king is on the throne. And I don't know how much of Daniel you know in terms of history, but Daniel lasted through more than one king. He lasted through changes in rulers. And it wasn't just as simple as handing it down to, the firstborn son. It was a regime change. He endured through a regime change, which is pretty remarkable. So he was able to function in Babylon no matter who the king was, whether it was the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, whether it was the king of Persia. He knew how to function and perform the role that he was supposed to do in his generation. But if we take those dates that he gave us, such as the 25th of Adar, to attain to, then that's going to, I think, heighten our awareness, especially during the month of Adar, where it's kind of a dark month. The only thing it really stands out for is we have Purim, we have the fast and the feast of Esther. Well, I think in this coming year and up until 2024, I think that should be even more meaningful to us, because now we understand that Daniel's talking about the 17th of Tammuz. And if we calculate those years out every year, then it would be important every year. And I think that's the way the Holy One wants us to function, to always be ready. But that was a particularly difficult time, if you remember, because of Haman's wicked plot of genocide. And that plot does cycle through generation after generation. I don't think we have to wonder in terms of Daniel's prophecy when it will be. I think we already know when it will be. It will be in every generation. Someone will rise up and try to wipe out the people of God. So here's what it says in Daniel 1:1. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And that's something too, if you're not aware, Jerusalem went under a series of sieges. There wasn't just one. And they became intensively worse. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. Right, this is what helps us decode. We have read in the Torah portion that the warriors were like holy vessels. And so here we're going to see the same pattern, that King Nebuchadnezzar is going to take away from Judah some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. That's what he wants to do. He wants to take the holy vessels away from Judah, and he wants to plant them as trophies to his God. And so now we see Daniel's dilemma. He's been taken as a trophy, not necessarily in this deportation, by the way. There were several. But this is an example. It says, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom there was no defect, who were good looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Right here again in the smichut, when we look in the neighborhood, we can see this pattern again, where the warriors were the holy vessels of war. In this particular case, the youths, the intelligent, the good-looking, the cream of the Judean crop. These are the people that Nebuchadnezzar takes captive into Babylon. And then he wants them to be trophies to his God and therefore to serve him, which is pretty smart. You don't kill off all the skilled, smart people when you conquer a land. You simply repurpose them. And you use those abilities for yourself. In this particular case, he takes these holy vessels, these treasures, and he wants them to learn the literature and the language of Babylon, of Chaldea. So that was under Jehoiakim that Daniel and the other three men, young men, were deported to Babylon. Jehoiakim is going to die, right? He is going to be succeeded by King Jehoiachin. Okay, Jehoiakim. But Jehoiachin, his son, it means Yod-He-Vav-He, establishes. And Jehoiachin is going to be the next to last king of Judah. And in fact, the interesting thing about this particular king, and he's young, I think he's only 18 years old when he takes the throne. We know Jehoiakim was evil, and it was under Jehoiakim that Daniel and his companions were deported to Babylon. His son, even though he's just as evil as his father, Jehoiakim, he does something pretty interesting. He only reigns 3 months, and the king of Babylon is got the city under siege again. The city's about to be destroyed. See, his father was able to buy him off. He gave him the best vessels. He gave him some of the vessels of the Holy Temple. He gave him some of the best vessels, the noble young men, the smart young men, the good-looking young men. And so that stopped the destruction temporarily. And then when Jehoiachin succeeds his father, he's only going to be able to reign 3 months. Now his father, and this is an interesting parallel because in both cases the number is 3. Jehoiakim reigned 3 years before he allowed the vessels and the people to be plundered. But he still remained as a kind of a puppet king. And then his son Jehoiachin will reign 3 months. So you see this decreasing time. You can almost feel them going into the straits from generation to generation before you know that there will be a complete destruction by Nebuchadnezzar. But even though he was evil like his father, Jehoiachin did something unexpected. Instead of trying to fight, instead of trying to escape, and we don't know if he was listening to the prophets or not. We know that Jeremiah would have been prophesying at this time. Likely Huldah would have been prophesying at this time. But even though he's evil, Jehoiachin does not do like his father. He doesn't buy off King Nebuchadnezzar by giving him vessels and by giving him people. Instead, he sacrifices himself for his people so that King Nebuchadnezzar would spare Judah. He takes his mother, he takes himself, he takes his immediate family, and he goes outside the city walls and he surrenders himself. So there's evil and there's evil. But in the son, we can see a glimpse of something. That there's something in him that compels him to sacrifice himself. And see, bad things happen to these kings when they're caught. When they lose the battle, I mean, their eyes are put out. Before their eyes are put out, their sons are slaughtered before their eyes. They're, horrible. Their heads are cut off. And so Jehoiachin, he knows this can happen to him, but he sacrifices himself to the king of Babylon anyway. And because of that, many of his people are spared. The good news is because of this, he wasn't killed, but he was taken into exile to Babylon. He was kept in prison. And after 36 years in the Babylonian prison, Jehoiachin is released and honored. Why is that important? It's important because the 25th of Adar is when he was released. And that's when the king of Babylon died and a new king succeeded him. That's why it's important. So when we look at Daniel's date and he's saying, calculate this out, and then we see that it lands on the 25th of Adar, and this is the only place in scripture where we can find the 25th of Adar. What we have to look forward to, and now we get why Daniel said you're blessed if you can attain this date, because it represents a day of release from the prison of Babylon. It represents a day of release from the confusion of Babylon. And then King Jehoiachin it says his throne was lifted above the thrones of the other kings of Babylon. He received a daily portion from the king's table. His needs were met all the days of his life. After that, we can look at this as an example that the precious vessels of the temple, it's the people. And just like we looked last week at Jerusalem's wall, the stones of Jerusalem's wall is people, it's living stones, righteous people. But when the righteous are carried away, it leaves very serious breaches and fallen walls. Just as when the righteous are carried away, the temple's going to fall. And then abominable practices are going to be set up in the holy places. The good news is, we have to face it, we're in exile because we're not in Israel. Now, if we were sitting in Israel and all things were good, then this may not have the same importance. But because we can identify and we say, yeah, we're in exile too. You know what? We don't get to go up to Jerusalem 3 times a year. We don't get to worship in the Holy Temple. We don't get to observe the commandments, the wonderful commandments that can only be observed in the land right now. But there's no place to bring those first fruits or to bring those tithes and so forth. So we're in exile. If we're not in the land, we're in exile. But what do we see? Daniel and his companions are treated well. And we have to start seeing ourselves as the cream of the crop. We have to start seeing ourselves as the precious vessels. We have to start seeing ourselves as the living stones. And so our job is not to make Babylon our home. Our job is to do our job in Babylon and never forget where home is. This is why Daniel would always face toward Jerusalem when he prayed, so that even in exile, even though he was called to do his job in exile, he determined never to forget where home was, and never to forget that he wasn't precious because he was so intelligent or so good looking or really good with languages. That's not why Daniel was precious. He was precious because he was part of that temple. He was part of Jerusalem that he left behind. And we have to take on that same identity as Daniel. The man who is an example to us of fasting and prayer. We have to see ourselves as precious. Otherwise, we will lose our connection with those living stones of Jerusalem. We will lose our connection as holy vessels that don't really belong where we are. We belong in a holy temple in Jerusalem. Jerusalem above, no less. And so rather than just settling in for the duration, which will lure us into the confusions of Babylon, we have to maintain our identity. And one way that Daniel and his companions maintained that identity is they rejected the meat and the wine of Babylon. They said, okay, we'll go through your treatment program here, but let's just try this out. Why not let us have this diet, I would say more of the vegetarian. Why not just let us eat, good fruits and vegetables? Why not let us drink good water? Keep the meat, keep the wine. And as it turned out, even without the Babylonian meat and the wine, they thrived. And so they identified the trap of Babylon right off the bat. They said, okay, what's the greatest danger facing us right now? The danger was, and think, the conditions they're living in for that period are pretty good. If you're living in the king's court, you're going to have nice clothes, you're going to have nice food. It's going to be very, very like, wow, this Babylon's not bad. But that is the danger. The bridge that Babylon used is the same bridge that we see in this Torah portion, where now the Israelites are taking vengeance on the Midianites and the Moabites for sending their women in to lure the Israelite men into the worship of Baal Peor it didn't start with sexual licentiousness. It started with a meal. And once they sat down to eat and drink, when they rose up, it's just like with the golden calf. They sat down to eat and drink, and then they rose up to play. They rose up to sexual licentiousness. That's exactly what Balaam taught the Midianite women to do. Lure them in with a meal, a good meal, and then you can rise up and play. And when you do that, then they become treasures in the house of Baal Peor. Well, this is pretty much the same method that the king of Babylon is using. He's going to use the meat and the wine. He's going to use the good meal. And you have to be careful about the table in front of you. And if you're not familiar in terms of the vessels of the temple, what it means to be a vessel of the temple, then you can go back and you can review Heaven's Gold in a Clay Mold from the most recent workbook one. And I think there's also a YouTube video that we recorded in a class where I went over Heaven's Gold in a Clay Mold, just to help you understand who you are as a precious vessel and what it took to pour you out and to prepare you to be brought into the temple. But again, it's the meal that's going to be a trap, because we know that the meats and the wines were all dedicated and offered to foreign gods. Remember, that's what it said. That was our clue. It said that the king of Babylon wanted the holy vessels to be a treasure in the house of his God. Well, he wants the people to also be treasures in the house of his gods. The other trap that he uses, remember, he says, I want you to educate them in the literature and the language. And so now we know another trap. When we're in exile, when we're in Babylon, how do we come out from among her? When we know that our divine mission right now must be to work where we are in Babylon. Not so many people have the opportunity to go live in the land and to do the mission that they're called to do there, even though we make every effort to get our feet in there as often as possible. Most of us still have jobs to do right where we are. So we don't want to fall into the trap of the meat and the wine, the meal, because so much of idolatry, the idolatry is going to be accompanied by parties and by food. I mean, it's just like any other, what's the saying? When you look at a Jewish holiday, it pretty much goes, they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat, right? So celebrations, historically, we typically accompany them with food and drink. So we have to be careful. I think one of the great compromises years and years and years ago, I remember being a little girl and all my friends were dressing up on Halloween. And the deal was you dress up as whatever. You can even throw a sheet over your head and go knock on people's doors and they'll give you candy. It's the meal. And then the mindset is, well, I know we're not supposed to have anything to do with ghosts and witches and stuff, but, it's harmless. It doesn't mean anything. And, that's not the way that we see it. We don't see it as a violation of scripture. Plus, you don't want your children to feel left out. That's the trap. It's in the food. And then what you realize, it's more than just the food, it's your stupid way of thinking. And it's the wrong kind of love. Because if you truly love that child and didn't want them to be left out, you wouldn't want them to be left out of the kingdom. not out of the candy. So the table can be a snare and a trap. We've talked about the grape line, how when you drink wine or alcohol, how it can blur the line. You have to be very, very, very careful not to cross that line. And in Daniel's day and time, part of avoiding the meat and the wine is because they were very specifically dedicated to other gods, to demons, basically. And so there wasn't really any way around that. If you can't go out and slaughter your own food, then you don't really have control over the gods and so forth, that the names that are spoken over it before it's presented to you, if you serve the king's court. And so the next trap is going to be knowledge and aesthetics, basically the arts. Teach them the fine arts. And so that again is still a challenge to us. If we live in Babylon, and we do, I'm betting that 100% of you, when you were in high school, had to take a course, probably in your English class, where you had to learn Greek and Roman mythology. So as part of the curriculum, you had to learn the names of foreign gods. And it probably didn't hurt you, right? It just made it easier to understand Shakespeare. So you could understand, the face that launched 1,000 ships. And terms like that are used so much in literature. But it's kind of a self-perpetuating culture. So we have to be really, really careful here in exile when we're into acquiring knowledge and when we're doing things that we would consider the arts. Because dance is a beautiful thing when it's a modest thing. When it is sexually enticing, then it's Babylonian, it's Moabite, it's Midianite, because of what it's provoking and evoking in the dance. If we look at, let's say, painting, there's beautiful works of art, but there's, if you just look up the word arts, it'll pull up statues of naked people. It'll pull up paintings of naked people. And so there's a confusion of things. You can be an artist and you can use it for good. But because we're in exile, you constantly have to exercise discernment if you are an artist, if you're a singer, if you're a musician, if you're a painter. Any of those things can draw you into a place of confusion. And you have to guard your heart. The same thing with knowledge. We've all got books. And nowadays, television takes the place of book reading for a lot of people. But whether it's a book, you're watching a movie that is also taken from literature, or I don't know what it's taken from nowadays, but you have to discern even what books you read. And so rather than becoming afraid of everything, what that tells us is we have to be like Daniel. We have to fast at certain times. We need to pray daily. And we need to be immersed in the Word, which is part of prayer, so that if we are involved in the arts, if we are involved in acquiring knowledge, if we are involved in sharing a table with other people, that we don't allow those gateway things to introduce confusion into our lives. Because some things are harmless, some things are even useful, but some of it is designed simply to suck you in and to suck you down. so that you will become a treasure in the house of another god, instead of a holy vessel in a holy temple that is going to be restored one day, by the way. It wasn't restored to Daniel, but it was restored to men like Ezra and Nehemiah. And we're not told when we're born what's going to happen. We don't know if we're going to be a Daniel and die in exile. We don't know if we're going to be an Ezra or a Nehemiah and we're going to get gathered back in and have a new opportunity to build the walls of Jerusalem, a new opportunity to build the holy temple of Jerusalem, a new opportunity to worship in the holy temple of Jerusalem. But what Daniel teaches us is we can repair the walls right where we are in Babylon. We can maintain the holiness of this vessel right where we are in Babylon. We can avoid the sensuality that leads to the idolatry that would lead us to become a trophy in the house of another god. And so I know our time is up right now. Let's see. Let's just kind of wrap up here with Jehoiachin and keep looking back to the garden and say, yeah, that's our pattern for everything. Typically, when we have to learn a lesson, we can look back to the garden and we can see the same thing that Daniel and his companions were offered. They were offered a chance at increased wisdom. They were offered a chance at very pleasant, rich food. They were offered elevated positions in the kingdom. And so maybe as wise young men, they spotted the similarity. They said, oh, wait a minute, this has happened before. This happened in the garden. The serpent offered, oh, you'll be like God. You'll know everything. You'll know the difference between good and evil. This fruit is pleasant. It's good to look at. It's going to be good to eat. He recycles that offer. No matter where we are, in exile, he will find ways to reintroduce these offers. And so seeking after increased wisdom and insight, that can be a trap for us. Because in the Hebrew roots movement, you see people get trapped by their own desire to know more than somebody else all the time. And when they acquire that, it does not humble them. It makes them arrogant. And in the long run, all they have acquired is more information, but they have not acquired the transformation of the Holy Spirit. Because they're still committing the same sins that brought the temple down. They're still murdering their brothers with their tongues. And so a point I wanted to make about Jehoiachin, who ended up, even though he started out evil, he became a sacrificial person. For the sake of his people, he gave himself into captivity. So his father's influence on him, it says, was evil. He walked in all the evil of his father. Yet, it says in 2 Kings 24:8, his mother's name was Nehushta. And it says that Nehushta went into captivity with her son, Jehoiachin. And Charlie Stallsworth brought this to my attention a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about Pinchas. That copper, which is one of the elements of brass, it has a cleansing property. Some of you might even be wearing copper bracelets. I have some of those Tommy Copper gloves for me to wear under my garden gloves, because as you get older, your hands get stiff and all that. And it's good if you're tending to get stiff joints and arthritis and so forth. copper does have qualities. It has healing, cleansing qualities. And so it's like a symbol. Remember the serpent on the stake? They had to look up at this copper bronze serpent if they wanted to be healed. So there's that element of healing in the copper. And so Nehushta, his mother, her name means brass. Which again, that we've just passed Parashat Pinchas, which means brass mouth. And through Pinchas' actions, the plague was stopped there. What happened? He was able to heal that breach because of the sexual licentiousness. And so having Pinchas always leading us into the straits of the 3 weeks, now we get Jehoiachin's mother's name, Nehushta, which means brass. So it's as though there's still some hope, there's still some cleansing, some healing properties that are clinging to Jehoiachin as he goes into exile. Something that is going to preserve him. Something that's going to give him a will to live. I mean, let's see, he was 18 and he was in exile 36 years. So it'd be 46. How old would that be? 46, 48, 52. So that's longevity. If you're living in prison, if you're living in exile, why not just give up? But he doesn't give up. He still has zeal for the house in exile. That sets him apart from the evil of his father. And so, yes, maybe we've all inherited some evil things from our ancestors. Maybe they didn't even know they were evil when they passed them down to us. But the difference, the thing that's going to set us apart is our willingness to live sacrificially. Even in the confusion in the prison of Babylon that we live in, we're not really in it. It doesn't really chain us. And that's what a sacrificial life does. It does not allow the things that you're afraid of to chain you to them. And the more zeal that you have for the house of Adonai in exile, the less that prison does seem like a prison to you. Instead, you see it as your job. And so we'll stop there. Let's save the rest for tomorrow. Let me go back and see if there's anything I need to make sure that's on the recording or not. No, the 2024 date would be the Gregorian. You would have to look at the corresponding year on the Hebrew calendar. It's 57 something.
$57.84.
$7.84. I don't know if that was on the slide as I went through it. I mean, on the recording, you'll be able to go back and pause it. And you can even look at my calculations on my notes. And then I took Colleen's, which were better than mine in terms of organization. I put hers on a slide too, so that you could see how she calculated hers out in a much more organized way.
Oh, Lisa. Hello.
Hello.
Lisa, you are still recording. Oh, no more.
Let me check just a second. Okay, I think anybody that's listening to the recording has got everything they need at this point. I just know that there's some things on the slides that if they're listening to it on their audio, they might be confused. And that's why I'm saying, go back and look at those slides and pause them so you can see how we did do the calculations.